Hi everyone, my name is Charlie and today I want to talk about my top 10 books of the first quarter of 2022. I have planned this video since the end of March, so a few months later we're finally getting around to this, and I want to get around to this before we do actually get to the end of June and I make one of these videos again. This is an idea I got from Dane of Dane Cobain, and I was waiting for him to put out his video, which he did about a month and a half ago, before I did this. But now, the top 10 books that I have read in the first 3 months of the year. This is not going to include any books from April to June. This is just January to March. And January I had quite a significant reading month, so a lot of the books do come from there. The first one being My Name is Lucy Barton by Elizabeth Strout, a book I do not own, so you're looking at Anything is Possible, which is the sequel, which tells the story of the town Amgash, which is where Lucy Barton originates. My Name is Lucy Barton sees our protagonist telling most of her story from her hospital bed. She is an older writer whose mother is coming to stay with her while she recovers from an operation. It deals with her relationships in life and maybe how her relationships as a child have affected her as she's grown up. There is a subtlety to Elizabeth Strout's prose that I first saw in Olive Kitteridge and which was ever present in My Name is Lucy Barton. These are stories in which it seems so simple in terms of the prose, but there is so much going on under the surface. They are a breeze to read through. There is this touch of pathos about everything, and these hints towards something that you get actual clarification for in later books. However, in My Name is Lucy Barton, it's presented as this memoir, and everything becomes meta later on in these other books where, indeed, in here you'll see people discover My Name is Lucy Barton, and it's almost as though it's fictional, and you have to see how that book has affected the residents of this town and how they're beginning to get an insight into what everything was in that book. I would say that maybe all of the books should be read. I did read them over quite a fast period of time, but that is just something within Elizabeth Strout's prose that I particularly adore. It's the way that she manages to craft the familial relationships, and there is this sense of love whilst also being able to recognise that the people you have loved the most within your life have also been the people to cause you the most pain, and how our successes and how us rising out of impoverished conditions and rising out of difficulty can sometimes be used against us and can sometimes be seen as a bad thing because people think that we are forgetting where we came from, and some people want to just keep us cowed and keep us as to the people that they know us as. Particularly insightful, subtle prose when it comes to not just capturing one person but capturing relationships, and the relationships that close relationships that we have in a family and those of an entire town. Then we have A Tidy Ending by Joanna Cannon. This is a book that I considered pushing back and not mentioning until April because it wasn't released until April. However, I did read the arc in January. This book follows Linda, who works in a charity shop and is often maligned by society. She is seen as one of the outsiders who doesn't particularly know how best to get on with people. She becomes obsessed with the person who previously lived in her house. And this tale of obsession can only end one of two ways. This is a deceptive novel. It is particularly psychological. I have never read a psychological thriller told in such a quaint, cosy manner. Joanna Cannon has this ability to capture voice in an incredibly fantastic fashion. It always seems fitting to the character and also manages to convey to the reader an idea of who the person is, and the reader has to use their own preconceived notions and reconsider them when it comes to a protagonist, and I like that. What we have here is, once again, this style that seems reminiscent of Alan Bennett. I would say that she captures voices in a way that Tinniswood could. This novel went in a direction that I didn't expect. I felt sorry for our protagonist throughout the majority of the novel, and this worked well, and it also caused me to question the ways that I view certain people in society. I have known people like Linda. With Linda working at the charity shop, she already had my heart because I work in a charity shop as well, and I think that it was just very well done. The way that Linda struggled with relationships, and us as a reader, we as readers could see exactly what these people felt about Linda, even though she couldn't see it for herself, and just the struggles that she went on. There was something Victoria Wood in this outsider woman just navigating her way through life and having something of the dark history. I found myself reminded of, is it Pam and Margaret or Pat and Margaret, the film where Victoria Wood plays the long-lost sister of Julie Walters' character, who went on to become a star in LA and has forgotten all about her past. And I was reminded of the disparity there with this novel. I found it particularly charming whilst also being somewhat dark. Very much a Rose and Thorns type situation when it comes to a tidy ending, and I heartily recommend it. Then we have Square Haunting, 5 Women, Freedom and London Between the Wars by Francesca Wade. This is on here because I read this a bit compulsively. I very much enjoyed finding out about these women whose only connection was that they happened to live on the same square. I think that you learn a lot about feminism in the 20th century and the ways in which feminism was used to perhaps heighten the respect of certain women in society, but it didn't serve every woman, and I think that this captured that well. I liked finding out more about Dorothy L. Sayers. Indeed, I do want to go and read more by the author. Virginia Woolf as well. Virginia Woolf is an author whose only book I have read is Mrs. Dalloway, and I do want to read more in future. I think that the way that the author captured all these different stories and pulled them together to create this narrative of a space and also explore the way that women were viewed in society was done exceptionally well. We managed to get a history of these characters, these real people, and it didn't follow a linear storyline, but it didn't have to in order to have this impact. Like, it wouldn't have made sense to constantly dart back and forth. We got the story of each individual and sometimes got to see how they would cross paths with one another in later life, and I liked that. As indeed I like the way that this book was written, and I kept it on my shelf because I found myself particularly enthusiastic, and I want to read Dorothy L. Sayers and then go back and read the portion about her again. Well, the same I want to do with Virginia Woolf. I have to admit, I didn't know about Eileen Power, Jane Allen Harrison and H.D. before reading this book, but their lives are just so rich and different, and stories that I never expected to come out of the 20th century, and thus changed notions that I might have had about that era. Then we have At Mrs Lippinkos by Elizabeth Taylor. There had to be an Elizabeth Taylor on here. I have enjoyed the majority of the Elizabeth Taylor that I've read, and this was no different in that you have Julia and Roddy. And Roddy is, well, and then you have Roddy's sister as well. And this book is different to Elizabeth Taylor's other books in that this is actually set during the war. Most of the Elizabeth Taylor that I have read has been exploring what it was like for women not between the wars, post-war, and the way that they didn't necessarily want to settle back into the lives that they had pre-war, where they were just seen as being housewives and making a home for the children and their husband, as opposed to having any sort of life of their own. Well, here we have a woman who is struggling against that. She doesn't want to be this housewife. She still recognises that she's young. Her husband's a bit older than her husband's sister's there, and they are very much domineering, trying to control who she is and how she behaves. They keep questioning her behaviours, how she fawns over her son, saying that it isn't going to inspire a strong man if she continues to behave the way she does towards her son. Yet her husband is absent and he's a dickhead. And I never claimed to be a good reviewer. I never claimed to do any of that. I'm just discussing my thoughts here. But her husband is a right royal tosser. and he expects stuff from his wife that he himself doesn't believe in. And I was very happy with the direction that Elizabeth Taylor took this novel. For something so short, she managed to explore how women don't necessarily need to change, well, nobody needs to change their personality in able to grow as a person. And I think that Elizabeth Taylor captured that well here, and also captured this sense that not all was right. Just because somebody was viewed well in society doesn't mean that they were doing well at home, and doesn't mean that they were good to the people who were supposed to be closest to them. Then we have Things We Do Not Tell the People We Love by Huma Qureshi, which is my favourite short story collection of the year. I don't know whether it's the only one I've read, can't remember, but it's fantastic. At first, I didn't know what I was getting into with this story about teenage adolescent love, but it soon took a turn. Indeed, that was the thing about all of these stories. It's a collated collection, all running along this general theme of things we do not tell those we love. There are a few stories in here which I recall not necessarily with fondness, but with fondness of the prose and the way that the author presented things. As with Elizabeth Strout, there is subtlety here. There is a lot going on beneath the surface. There is stuff that the reader recognises, dramatic irony that the characters don't necessarily realise themselves. And it's also a collection that doesn't necessarily explore Western ideas of family and relationships. You have to remember that when going into these short stories, that these stories are not necessarily from a perspective that you can understand, but you could perhaps gain some empathy through reading them, although that is never a reason to go in and read a piece of literature. Very strong collection. Stunning prose, which means nothing really. To me, it means that the prose was well done, that it was crafted in a way that I thought was strong, and that I didn't feel as though there was anything lacking or anything loose when it came to a narrative. Very spurious when it comes to me giving any sort of review. I do think that short story collections are very difficult to review as well, because you can't necessarily go and discuss an entire narrative. You can discuss moments, as I have done, but not necessarily talk about them in the fullness of a collection, such as the climax to one story, which felt like the explosion that was necessary, whereas you have another one where a mother just won't recognise that maybe she is the problem. And there is a lot of that in here. There is a lot of discussion about the obstacles that parents put in our way, but maybe also the ways in which parents always seem to feel as though they have a claim over their child. That sort of thing. There are a lot of discussions about relationships and the way that early relationships may affect the way that we behave in later life, or things that happen earlier in our lives can also affect the way in which we view a person in later life, despite the fact that they might think that we are over that experience. Qureshi discusses a lot. Then we have Deborah Levy with The Cost of Living. I would say that any of Deborah Levy's living memoirs ought to be read. She is doing something particularly fantastic when it comes to the memoir, in that she is doing what ought to be done with memoir and writing it as though it is a fiction. She is using elements that we often see used in fiction in order to craft her memoir in a way that pulls bits from throughout her life to discuss an entire topic and discuss a theme. And in term, I chose The Cost of Living because it's the book in the middle, but personally, any of them is something that I could go and reread for writerly philosophy, for a history of a part of the world that I didn't know about, for this idea that nothing is linear and it's told as in the way that a mind would work, in the way that sometimes you're thinking you're living in the present and something will call you back to the past. And that's the way this book goes. It's almost this yo-yoing of thoughts, of thinking about something, going back to an event where this could be discussed, and then returning and centering yourself in a location again. Deborah Levy's writing is just experimental, but only experimental in if you believe that there is any sort of structure to novels, or that there should be any sort of structure. A reflective memoir, but also feels very much in the moment. I was just particularly thrilled to read all three of these. I read them in succession. I just couldn't help myself. It just felt like this outpouring of thoughts that I connected with, in a similar fashion to the next book that I'm going to be talking about, which is Loop by Brenda Lozano, translated by Annie McDermott. I had to read this for the BookTube Prize in a video that still hasn't been created. I don't know whether it ever will. Loop was one of my top 3 books. This, again, does something that I've recently found that I enjoy, as with Sigrid Nunez, Deborah Levy, Rachel Cusk, and it's told in this fragmentary style. I did not care for that when I read No One Is Talking About This by Lockwood last year, but that's because Lockwood went and changed the trajectory of that novel from the halfway point, whereas it started as all of these fragmentary, disparate pieces, and then the whole that it was connecting to didn't actually work. Whereas here, you've got all these fragmentary pieces that are told in the style of a notebook and are told as though the character is making notes, but the fragments are all linked to each other. So it's very chaotic, almost like a Choose Your Own Adventure, which was another book that we had for the BookTube Prize, but it causes the reader to work. And I particularly enjoyed that. It gives you an idea of the character's mind and where they are in each moment within the text. I particularly enjoyed this way of writing. I don't think it's something that I could ever hope to achieve myself, but it's this idea that nothing is linear. It's something I have tried in the Doris books, in that Harold is usually in a present moment and he's discussing stuff that goes on in the past, and he'll disappear into a reverie and then come back into the present moment. And it's the way that we do have conversations with one another, in that sometimes we'll be using the present participles to discuss the past, because for us, something that happened a long time ago can seem very much in the moment. And I like the way that these books did this, and I liked this. I mean, this isn't told in a fragmentary style, this one is, but it's the fragments felt like a jigsaw, and I like a jigsaw. I liked the images that were presented here and the way that the images were flashed at you. It's almost like going through a slideshow of a person's life. Then we have Build Your House Around My Body by Violet Kupersmith. This was longlisted for the Women's Prize, and I particularly enjoyed this one. It blended what I like to see blended in fiction here, in that you had this very almost crime noir story, blend it with David Mitchell's flitting about all over the place in time, blend it with some folklore that from a part of the world that I didn't know about, add in touches of fantasy and mystery, bits of horror and gore in there, and just it's a recipe for something that I enjoyed, whilst also discussing how a person can feel like an outsider and doesn't necessarily experience the world in a way that other people are experiencing the world. Other people maybe go through life doing stuff, activities, and feeling very present, and we have a character who doesn't feel those things and is just going through the motions because she's very unsure of her position, in terms that her brothers seem to be doing so much better than her, and she's feeling similar to Linda in A Tidy Ending, maligned, outcast, and she's perhaps doing things that she wouldn't do was she in a stable state. And it helps to create this frenetic sense of the fantasy and the folklore maybe causing her to behave in a certain fashion, or these discoveries have happened after the fact. The entirety of this whole non-linear structure, see, that's the thing. Maybe that's the thing. Maybe Charlie's decided he doesn't like linearity anymore. Because that's what goes on with a lot of these books, isn't it? They're all over the place in terms of time and space, but apparently that's something I like. Next, we have Cold Enough for Snow by Jessica O. Very short, thoughtful book discussing the relationship between a mother and a daughter. And it turned out that the question I had is also a question that a ton of other readers have had. So I am not alone, nor am I as intellectual and original as I was leading myself to believe whilst reading this book. This is a meditative, slow exploration of the relationship between this mother and daughter as they vacation together. I particularly enjoyed the silence of it all and the way that the reader can just glide through the book and consider everything that the author wants them to consider. Of course, I must think it's good. It's in a top 10 of the first 3 months. And finally, we have This One Sky Day by Leone Ross. I should say with This One Sky Day and Build Your House Around My Body by Violet Kupersmith, I do have vlogs for those books, so you can go back and watch. Indeed, I have discussed all of these books in wrap-ups in the past. But with This One Sky Day by Leone Ross, I was left conflicted because this is a book about an island set over one day following a number of characters, all of whom have their own different magical ability, and they are supposed to work in conjunction with the island. There is something within this book about control and the way that certain people within this very small island community are trying to control everything else on the island, and almost the island is fighting back. It felt very much like a novel about how no matter what, we cannot control every single aspect of our lives. We can't control everything because there is a world against us. And that if we do fight back, no, not necessarily fight back, if we do try and control everything and we try and conquer an entire space, we can't blame anything else for the repercussions that we might face. There's also a love story in here that I hummed and hawed over because I didn't necessarily like where it was going in the beginning. I think that the start of this book is incredibly slow, and I'm not sure it needs to be as slow as it was. But overall, I did appreciate the magic and the sense of community and the way this narrative picked up pace towards the end. And I liked the way that characters came together and how the connections ended up being made, even if they did feel a bit shoehorned in the beginning. And that's them. Those are the 10 books that I would call my favourites, my top 10 of the first 3 months of the year. Hopefully, I'll keep doing this every 3 months, and then when we get to the end of the year, I will have a top 40, of which we will have to pick a top 10. I tried doing a ranking system this year where I pulled the books out of a box and pitted them against one another, but I didn't like how it worked out, which is why you didn't get a top 10 of 2021. But maybe a top 40 is a much easier way to go about things. If you've read any of these books and have the same or different opinions and would like to discuss them, then please feel free to do so in the comments. I hope that you have enjoyed this video, and until next time, that is all.